The Dune saga was adapted to the big screen in the 80s and more recently in 2021. Paul Atreides is the son of Duke Leto Atreides, who rules over the planet Caladan. His mother is Lady Jessica. She's a member of the Bene Gesserets, a prominent political and religious sisterhood. Bene Gesserets train their minds to obtain superhuman powers. I recently got injured playing floorball, but it could be worse. I could be sent to Arrakis. Duke Leto is given stewardship of the important planet Arrakis, formerly ruled by House Harkonnens. Dune has the monopoly on the production of spice melange, which is the most valuable substance in the universe. Spice is used to travel in space and as a narcotic to expand the mind. But the stewardship is a complex trap to destroy House Atreides, who represent a direct political threat to the Emperor. The 1984 movie introduces Paul in this scene. We see him study Arrakis on his computer with his back to the door. He's not supposed to sit like this because it makes him a target for enemies, but he does it anyways. When Thufir, Dr. Yui, and Gurney walk in, he says, "I know, Thufir, I'm sitting with my back to the door." Paul recognized their footsteps, so he knew these three were coming. But Thufir says, "Those sounds could be imitated." Paul smirks and replies, "I'd know the difference." So Paul is introduced as a know-it-all. He comes across as arrogant and overly confident in his abilities. It doesn't help that he's dressed in his ceremonial attire, complete with his Playmobil hair, making him even less relatable. But keep in mind, this movie is a product of its time. We'll expand on that in a bit. In the 2021 movie, Paul is introduced in this scene. He's having breakfast with his mother. When she tells him he must dress in his ceremonial attire, he sighs and asks, "Why do we have to go through all this?" Then Jessica demands that he uses the voice, and he fails at first. It shows that Paul is still learning. He doesn't know it all. Paul looks tired. Even Jessica notices. So it's clear that our main character is not a superhero. It's easier to relate to him and root for him. He's nonchalant, not arrogant in this first scene. Unsurprisingly, many scenes are similar in both movies, but Paul's portrayal is different. Take for example, Paul practicing his fighting skills. In the 1984 movie, when Gurney says Paul should practice fighting, he replies, "I'm not in the mood." Once again, his arrogance is on display. But Gurney calls his BS and fights him anyways, so practicing was forced on him. He did not partake willingly. In the 2021 movie, Paul is practicing his fighting skills on his own when Gurney joins him for practice. That's when Gurney tells Paul, "Don't stand with your back to the door. How many times must we tell you?" Paul recognized the footsteps, so he knew Gurney was coming. But Gurney says, "Someone might imitate my stride." Paul dismissively replies, "I'd know the difference." So 2021 Paul is arrogant too. He later gaslights Gurney by calling him old man. In the 1984 movie, Paul says, "I'm not in the mood," in an attempt to avoid practice. But in the 2021 movie, Paul says, "I guess I'm not in the mood today," to justify his poor performance mid-battle. After practice, Gurney forcefully warns Paul of the incredible danger facing House Atreides. He says, "You don't get it, do you? You don't really understand the grave nature of what's happening to us." 2021 Paul is still innocent and untested. He has yet to appreciate the scope of the world he inhabits, and people around him try to prepare him as best they can. This is different in the 80s movie. Paul is aware of the complex political situation House Atreides is thrown into. Thufir tells Paul, "Many dangers exist on Arrakis. For one, the Harkonnens would not have given up so easily." Paul replies, "Behind the Harkonnens, I suspect the Emperor." To which Thufir replies, "You'll make a formidable duke." So unlike 2021 Paul, this version of the character is more aware of his situation, but he's also constantly reminded of his greatness. The next scene is so iconic in both movies. The Bene Gesserets arrive on Caladan in the dead of night, and the Reverend Mother seeks to submit Paul to the Gom Jabbar Test to determine if his awareness is stronger than his instincts. In the 1984 movie, the Reverend Mother asks Paul to meet her in Jessica's chamber in 15 minutes. By the way, Jessica is melodramatic in this version. We'll touch on her portrayal later in this video. A lot has changed since the 80s. Paul shows up in his ceremonial attire as usual. He has not been briefed about what's coming or the danger he's in. In the Denis Villeneuve movie, it is Jessica who wakes Paul up. This gives her the opportunity to quickly brief him on what's coming. This version of Paul is more emotionally aware, so he senses his mother's fear. He asks Yui, "What's happening?" Then Jessica signs to Paul, "Remember your training." Throughout the 2021 version, Paul and Jessica will sign to each other in challenging moments. It also helps establish their bond. Before being left alone with the Reverend Mother, she adds, "You must do everything the Reverend Mother tells you." The Reverend Mother uses the voice to bring Paul to his knees, but his arrogance remains. In the 1984 movie, Paul asks, "Are you suggesting the Duke's son is an animal?" 2021 Paul says, "How dare you use the voice on me?" So the test begins and Paul is in excruciating pain, but he survives the test. Both movies portray this similarly, but the aftermath is different. In the 1984 movie, Paul stays on his knees and calmly speaks with the Reverend Mother. She tells him about spice and the Kwisatz Haderach. In this version, Paul is often fed information. In the 2021 movie, Paul steps back from the Reverend Mother as soon as the test is over. He's more defiant, and she does not tell him about the Kwisatz Haderach. Instead, he learns about it when he eavesdrops on Jessica and the Reverend Mother's conversation, and Jessica tells him about the Bene Gesserit's breeding program. The next scene depicts the Atreides' departure for Arrakis. In the version from the 80s, this scene is grand. Paul, the Duke, and Jessica all wear matching coats. It feels as though they're in this together. There is a ceremonial aspect to their departure, with members of the military lined up against a gold background. And the pug is iconic. The 2021 movie shows Paul spending time alone, reflecting on his faith as preparations for the big move are underway. We see him put his hand in the waters of Caladan as to say goodbye to his home planet. He looks apprehensive, and he's alone. They travel through the Spacing Guild's space folder. They eventually land on Arrakis and make their way to the seat of power previously occupied by the Harkonnens. In the 1984 movie, Paul has a lot of internal dialogue. This is faithful to the source material. The book is full of internal dialogue too. In this scene, for example, we hear Paul's internal dialogue in voiceover. He says, "A hunter-seeker? Who is operating that thing? It has to be someone in the palace." In the 2021 movie, we don't hear Paul's internal dialogue. Instead, when he catches the hunter-seeker, he says out loud, "It's a hunter-seeker. The operator must be nearby." In another scene, Paul and Duke Leto prepare to inspect the spice production. They wear still suits designed to be worn in the open desert of Arrakis. The Imperial ecologist Dr. Leet Kynes makes sure that the Duke and Paul fitted their still suits correctly. They fly to the harvest location where they spot a worm. So, the spiced harvester prepares to evacuate, but they experience a mechanical failure. So the Atreides decide to rescue the crew on board. In the 1984 version, Paul stays put on the ship. That's when he inhales spice for the first time. It doesn't appear to affect him. In the 2021 version, Paul is much more involved in their rescue. Duke Leto puts Paul in charge of guiding the crew on the ship. That's when Paul inhales spice for the first time, and it affects him so much he needs to be rescued by Gurney. After the incident, Duke Leto reprimands him. In the 1984 version of Dune, Paul takes more spice after returning to the palace, and he has visions of the Reverend Mother, but he's not affected otherwise. In Denis Villeneuve's Dune, Paul does not take more spice after they return from the desert, but he's so affected by the first intake that Dr. Yui examines him. He says, You seem to be sensitive to spice. You'll be fine. Paul then tells Jessica about the vision he had while tripping on spice. He saw Chani killing him. Paul also tells Jessica that he knows she's pregnant. The 1984 movie has an intimate scene between Jessica and Duke Leto. It happens on Caladan before they leave for Arrakis, and it somewhat implies that it's at that moment that Jessica became pregnant. The 2021 movie does not have that scene. Eventually, the Atreides come under attack. Their shield is down, they are bombarded, and Duke Leto is taken hostage to be brought to the Baron. What happens next to Paul and Jessica is different in both movies. In the 1984 version, they're taken hostage and the Baron pays them a visit before being taken on a ship to be dropped in the desert. In the 2021 movie, Paul and Jessica are also taken hostage, but they don't meet with the Baron. Instead, the Harkonnens immediately make them board a ship with the intent to drop them in the desert and let them die. The Harkonnens gag Jessica so she can't use the voice on them. In the 1984 version, Paul attempts to use the voice but fails the first time. Then, the co-pilot sexually assaults Jessica, which prompts Paul to try the voice again. He says, "Remove her gag," and it works. In the 2021 version, Jessica signs to Paul that the scarred one is deaf, which is a problem if they want to use the voice. Then, the co-pilot suggests they should drop Paul in the desert and keep Jessica on board to assault her. Paul says, "Don't you dare touch my mother." He then tries the voice but fails. Jessica signs to him to find the right pitch. The Harkonnens open the back door of the ship to throw Paul out, which prompts him to try the voice again. He says, "Remove her gag," and it works. This is a big difference between both movies. In the contemporary version, Paul and Jessica work as a team. In the 80s version, Paul almost becomes Jessica's savior from that point on. The rest of these movies are defined by this mother-son relationship. So it's interesting to see how much we progressed in portraying strong female characters. After all, these movies were produced almost 40 years apart. In the 1984 version, Jessica uses the voice and orders the co-pilot to kill the pilot. Then, she orders him to cut Paul's bonds. So, in this version, Paul is viewed by Jessica as a more valuable asset to take control of this situation. Paul knocks the co-pilot out and takes control of the ship while Jessica remains bonded. In the 2021 version, Jessica uses the voice and orders one man to kill another before ordering him to cut her ropes. She orders him to give her the knife before she kills him. Jessica then frees Paul and tells him, "Your pitch was too forced." The pair seek refuge in the desert, hiding under a makeshift tent. At this point of the story, the timeline differs quite a lot in both movies. Some scenes are not in the same order, for example, and the difference between both portrayals of Paul's character are even more apparent, especially when it comes to emotions. In the 1984 version, when Jessica senses that Leto is dead, she loses her mind and cries, while Paul remains calm like a G.I. Joe. Paul feels no emotion. When the ship crashes, he screams at Jessica to hurry. She holds on to him. Jessica is weak and collapses on the ground. We hear Paul's internal dialogue. He says, "Where are my feelings? I feel for no one." Which is straight up crazy considering that most people he knows died in the attack. In the 2021 movie, when Jessica senses that Leto is dead, she cries silently. Paul looks down and holds his father's ring. Later, he turns on his pocket light and realizes there is spice everywhere, and it affects him again. He coughs and has visions of the holy war that's coming. He sees his return to Caladan. He's sweaty and he cries. Jessica looks worried. Paul begs for help. He's losing his mind. When Jessica kisses him in an attempt to calm him, Paul screams at her. He says, "Get off me. You did this to me. Your Bene Gesserets made me a freak." Then they hug again and mourn the loss of Leto together. This version of Paul is more vulnerable and he definitely has feelings. In the 80s movie, Paul has a dream while in the desert. He knows it's because of the spice. He tells Jessica, "It's poison. You knew the spice would change me, but thanks to your teaching, it's changing my consciousness." That's when he tells her he knows she's pregnant. Then Paul screams, "Father!" while looking at the sky. It's very, very dramatic. In an internal dialogue, Paul vows to avenge Leto's death and destroy the Emperor. In the 2021 movie, Paul and Jessica get out of their tent and are rescued by Duncan Idaho. He kneels in front of Paul and calls him Duke. So it's implied that Paul is now the head of House Atreides, or whatever is left of it. They board the ship. Duncan will die trying to save the two. So Paul and Jessica will be left on their own once again. They escape to the desert where their ship crashes. Duncan never saves the Atreides in the 1984 version. Paul tells Jessica they must find safety by reaching a rock mountain before a worm emerges. Paul plans to stomp her while Jessica stays back. He then mansplains to her. He says, "Remember, walk without rhythm and we won't attract the worm." They start making their way to the rock and, ironically, they walk with rhythm. Eventually, the worm appears, so they start to run. Paul tells Jessica, "Faster!" She keeps falling down, but Paul never falls. He's so athletic. And they finally make their way to safety. Jessica cries. This scene is different in the 2021 version. Paul and Jessica put on their still suits after their ship crashes. It's presumably the first time she's wearing one. Their plan is to find the Fremen. Jessica spots a rock. They decide to head there when night falls. Paul explains how to walk in the desert, but unlike in the 80s, he's not mansplaining. He says, "We'll have to walk like the Fremen do." It's called the sand walk. So they start making their way to the rock without rhythm. Eventually, the worm appears anyway. So they start to run, and they both fall. Jessica makes it to safety first in this version. Back in 1984, Paul and Jessica come face to face with the Fremen. The leader of the Fremen calls Paul a boy man and says he shall have sanctuary in my tribe. So it's implied that Jessica would not be welcomed. So Jessica grabs the leader by the neck and Paul escapes. The leader tells the Fremen, "Get back, she has the weirding way." So the leader is forced to negotiate. He's willing to give both Paul and Jessica sanctuary if Jessica teaches the Fremen the weirding way. Jessica accepts. That's when Paul meets Chani for the first time. In the 2021 version, Paul and Jessica don't get sanctuary that easily. Paul signs to Jessica, "We are not alone." They are surrounded by the Fremen. The leader of the Fremen says Paul can have sanctuary since he's trained, but not Jessica. So both Jessica and Paul fight. Jessica holds a blade to the leader's throat, and Paul points a gun. The standstill comes to an end for now. That's when Paul meets Chani for the first time. Later, Paul is challenged to a fight, and he eventually wins. This grants both Paul and Jessica sanctuary amongst the Fremen, but Paul is shaken by what just happened. Earlier, Jessica said, "Paul never killed a man." Paul and Jessica join the Fremen, and that's where the 2021 movie ends, but not the 1984 version. So I guess we'll have to wait for the new movie from Denis Villeneuve to continue comparing these two takes on Paul Atreides. Until then, click on this video, you might like it.